All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It is so good to see you all. Whether you were on the first time or whether you're coming to the second workshop tonight for the first time, it will be just fine either way. And I want to say welcome to our second workshop. This is Effective Conversations Using the BRAVE Technique. I have a couple of quick announcements and then I'm going to turn it over to Brandon. So after tonight, what we hope, if you haven't been doing it already, is that you'll go out and have conversations. Practice is the only way to grow our skills and have an impact. So that's what we want to do. The next workshop after this one, number 3, is in 2 weeks and a day. So it moves back to Thursday. And Brandon will be back with us again to debrief the conversations that we've had in the next 2 weeks. We'll get a chance to share what we tried, where we got stuck, what worked, didn't work, what came up, ask questions, and be together. And I am looking forward to that. And then after that, we will continue having goal setting and debriefing check-ins on Zoom. And those will continue to be on Thursday nights, but we'll start them an hour earlier at 6 Central, and they'll be just for 45 minutes. So that'll start on May 8th. And our regional coordinator, John Sabin, who I hope remembers this, will facilitate the first one because I'll be visiting my son in Finland then. And then we'll keep that going every other week until July 4th, which we'll skip, and then we'll resume on July 11th. All of that is in the Wisconsin CCL calendar on our website at, remember this, cclwi.org. So the last announcement then before Brandon starts is that CCL National also thinks conversations about climate are important, including voting and climate conversations. And they've launched a goal of 25,000 climate conversations this month, which they are sure we can do because it's Earth Month and you're going to be out there tabling too. And what they do is create a really easy way to report your numbers in the action tracker. And so I want to show you because I had a climate voter conversation last week with the pharmacist who was giving me my shingles shot. We were in one of those little booths at Walgreens, and one thing led to another because it was election day in Wisconsin. So you should be hopefully looking at my dashboard where it says Hello Madeline on CCL Community. And you'll see right there front and center, 25,000 climate conversations, 21 days left, and 1,658 conversations have happened already. And what you should also be able to see is a little take action button over here. So all I have to do to report my conversation is click take action. And then the next page comes up and it says number of conversations. All I have to do is put the right one in. Now, if I had gone up and down my street or something and had 10, I'd switch that to 10. But I'm going to just log my one with the pharmacist. And bingo, it's done. If I want, I can take a survey and tell them how it went, but I don't have to do it. I just want to say that doing that makes me feel really satisfied. It's like it's a marker. I did that. It's not forgotten. And so I hope that you will have fun logging your actions too. And I'm really thrilled that the tech team pulled that one off. So we will again thank everybody at the end of the night and give you those next steps again. But right now, I just want Brandon to be able to get going. So over to you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here with you tonight. Would love to see by a show of electronic or physical hands, how many of you were in the part 1 training? Okay, great. So no worries if you weren't in part 1. We are going to do a little bit of a recap of the Brave conversations. The thing we won't be recapping tonight is mapping your personal network, but we can give you, I think, the recording to help get caught up on that, and that will be pretty easy to get caught up on. The piece that we're going to do tonight that's going to be a little bit more interactive, I'm super glad that you're here with, and I'm going to go ahead and share out my screen to get us started. Ooh, and do I see that Elizabeth Dell had a brave conversation at the chiropractor today? Is that correct? Oh, so I was just going to ask, we're jumping the gun a little bit because I got so excited to see in the chat, but I'm going to ask in a minute. Here, we'll get this started with the slides. I'm going to ask in a minute if there's anybody else who had conversations and if anybody would like to share. So our goals for this session tonight are going to be for anybody who did go ahead and try to have a conversation using the Brave methodology. Would love to hear how that went. And then we're going to go from there to recap what the acronym BRAVE stands for and the 5 component parts. And as we do our recap, we're going to take it to the next level of depth. So for the people who this is your first time, this is where you'll get the overview. And for the people who this is your second time, this is where some of those questions that you had towards the end, or maybe some questions that have been fomenting since, we'll hopefully try to answer with a deeper dive into some pro tips on how you can operationalize this framework in the wild with your friends, colleagues, neighbors, etc. And then we're going to dig into a couple of particular skills for making the brave conversations effective. And those are being an investigator. So what I mean by that is following the clues to unearth the shared values that you might have with the person that you're talking with your brave conversation style, and being able to then move from there to help unpack their story and share your story as well. Okay, so we already know Elizabeth tried out a conversation. Would love to see if anybody else tried out a conversation. And I'm going to take this off screen share for a minute so I can see everybody. So by a show of physical, now I can see you all. I couldn't see you all before if you raised your physical or electronic hand, but now I can. So by a show of physical or electronic hands, any other folks? Oh, I see Susan Myers. Awesome. And I see John Sabin. Okay, fabulous. Elizabeth, do you want to kick us off with a little share on how yours went?
Well, sure. Honestly, I can't say that I followed the Brave model because
That's okay.
I need a refresher. Let's put it that way. But
No
um
worries. Let's hear about how it was. No problem. That's
sure,
what we're here for tonight. So would love to hear how it went nonetheless.
sure. So he asked me, he knew that I had been on vacation and that we had been in Puerto Rico. So he asked how it was. And, we were talking about that and the ocean. I said, yeah, I said the water was, he asked if it was warm. I said, it was really warm. I said, and I don't know, maybe it's always that warm. But and I know that this issue is a concern. It has come up in previous times, but I was able to connect it also. He has some connections to Europe, and so I was able to talk a little bit about, what Europe is doing, and with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and just to kind of, draw out the conversation a little bit more.
Love it. So one of the key brave principles that's actually reflecting, even though you weren't like necessarily trying to go through the steps, is the concept of bringing the conversation into real lived experience. So we're staying out of like theoretical policy points. We're staying not forever necessarily, but at the beginning. We're staying out of TV talking points, and we're focusing on real lived experience. And one of the things that actually does from a sort of psychological standpoint, and what social psychologists have pointed out to us, is that when you share information with people and let them come to their own conclusion, so this is what we talked about last time as self-persuasion, they are more likely to be persuaded. So this, for example, can be how nonpartisan candidate report cards work when you don't necessarily say we're not doing candidates here tonight. We're a 501c3, I think, tonight, but when you show the in a 501c3 friendly way, the facts about a candidate and another candidate, and you're not telling them which one to vote for, they can kind of see the contrast and come to their own conclusion. Sharing real lived experience without necessarily telling the person what they should conclude, but letting them kind of think about it can be really helpful for that self-persuasion to happen. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Elizabeth. And do you prefer Elizabeth or Beth or something else entirely?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, perfect. All right. And Susan, would you be interested to share how your conversation went?
I asked a fellow volunteer at the thrift store where she stood on the environment because we were just reshelving clothes and things. And she stopped, real long pause, and she said, "Well, I'm a hunter, like to warn me." And I said, "Oh, well, I know other hunters." And we kind of talked a little bit about the environment. And she said, "And you probably won't like who I'm going to vote for." And I said, "Well, I wasn't even going to ask who you're going to vote for." But yeah, it kind of dissolved after that, but that was my first toe in the water.
Awesome. So I love that you're entering the conversation with curiosity. That's something that we're going to talk about tonight. And I think it's a good illustration of how deeply people have internalized the external media narratives that are dividing us. Um, and so, and have like that fear, right? That we talked about with the fight or flight. Like, I don't even want to talk about it because you might not like it. And, so a little tip that I'll give for folks, if anybody here gets in a conversation where somebody says to them, well, you're probably not going to like my position on this, or you're probably going to not going to like my candidate choice. That's a great moment to show non-judgment. And it's also a great moment to take the conversation to a deeper level. So you might be able to non-judgmentally say to them, well, actually, I'm just interested in why you care about that candidate, or how the choices are affecting you and your family, right? So you can kind of take it out of a back and forth that's about the candidate or the issue and make it more personally about them and wanting to learn more about them, and also about seeing them as a human and not as a tick box on a candidate slate or on an issue slate. And then we can move as we story share back into the issues. But just a little tip there. And then John Sabin, where did you go on my Brady Bunch grid here? Oh, there you are. Okay, great. John Sabin, I would love to hear how your conversation went.
Well, we had a problem in our town today where the local gas company put too much odorant in the gas.
Ooh.
So our neighborhood smelled like gas. And we were told, like, this is probably does not indicate a problem, but if you smell gas, you should call the fire department. So, like, there were fire trucks all over my neighborhood this afternoon. And I was out walking my dog, and I ran into a neighbor, and she hadn't seen this alert about this thing. So I was telling her what was going on. And then I said, I'm not really worried about it because, you know, gas furnace is the only gas appliance I have in my house, and it's not even turned on right now. And then I used that as a sort of jumping off point to tell her how we've been trying to convert all of our appliances to electric because gas is causing climate change. Using gas is heating the atmosphere. So she was like, oh, she didn't seem to understand that. And then we just kind of talked. Mostly I talked, I suppose. And she listened with interest as I told her about, the steps that we've taken to switch out gas appliances for electric. So, I don't know. I didn't do a great job of listening, I suppose. So she did. She did a great job to get her on the call.
Well, what I think is super useful about that conversation is like sort of utilizing something that's happening in our daily life as a jumping off point. And talking specifically about like, why did you as a human trade out your appliances? So it's like a very practical way to be able to communicate information and share information that has broader policy implications that again is rooted in the real lived experience. So I think that's a tool we can embed with some of the other skills, is to really talk about like what is actually happening in the neighborhood. Like last time we talked about Per Epson Stoknes's 5Ds, and one of them being distance, where a lot of times if we're talking about climate change as something distant and something really big and overwhelming, like we're talking in terms of glacial melting and a non-survivable planet and so forth, that can be really overwhelming to people, and it can cause a response where they sort of get paralyzed and overwhelmed. And so talking about things that are really concrete and actionable, like, oh, actually, I could trade out my stove for a different stove. Like that's something I can actually do. Oh, and if the whole neighborhood, oh, and if the whole town did, oh, okay. And people can see how that aggregates up. So I actually think it's a great tool to be talking about something specific, concrete, and personal neighborhood based that way. Okay, so the next question is, did any of you develop some what ifs? So we talked about a few at the end of the last session. And by what ifs, I mean, what if this happens in the conversation? How do I deal with X, Y, or Z potential thing that might happen or come up? So I'm wondering if anybody has any of those thoughts, whether you had them at the last session and you still remember them, if you had them between then and now, or if they've come up since this session has started. Would love to hear just like some of your curiosities about how do I do this in real life, or how do I address X, Y, and Z that might come up in the conversation. And you can type in the chat. Would love for folks to type in the chat. And then we will maybe call a couple folks off mute to address those. And in the meantime, while folks are sharing out any what ifs that you might have, I will just share this initial pro tip number 1, which is one way to sort of get yourself in a mode of curiosity for the conversation, which is a skill that we're going to come back to over and over again as we go through the 5 brave steps, is literally just thinking to yourself, I am going to learn some wonderful things about this person. When I first learned deep canvassing, a fellow that I used to go out with, who was one of the original developers of deep canvassing, and we co-authored a primer on it. He used to say before every door that we would go to where it was a stranger, he would get himself psyched up to like, oh, I'm so curious about what kind of interesting, neat person is waiting for me behind this door. So sometimes we get a little bit before our conversations, and we're worried about doing it right, and we're worried about, is it going to be successful, and will I know what to say? And it can be really helpful actually to the tone and quality of the conversation, which the person that we're speaking with will mirror back to us, to just think to yourself, ooh, I wonder what wonderful things I'm going to learn in this conversation. This is going to be great. Okay, I see no what ifs in the chat. So I'll do one last call for them. If anybody wants to raise a physical or electronic hand. Oh, I just found one. Okay, John, what if I'm just trying to listen non-judgmentally and the other person says, so what do you think? I've wondered how to get out of a tit for tat at that point. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So if somebody directly asks you, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? I think it's totally great. Just like give a very short version of what you think, and use that as an opportunity to do some story sharing where they can actually hear your values. So if somebody asks you, well, what do you think about climate change? In this context, you might say your one sentence about why you care about climate change and think it needs to be addressed. And that's why I'm really motivated, to vote this fall, and then move from there into a little story nugget about how do those values that are motivating you actually develop. So you're not going into, from that opening, a bunch of policy facts. You're going into your why, and you're going deeply enough into it that it's a little bit of a story share. And as we get into the story sharing section, we really want this to be conversational. So it's not going to be a case where you're yes, we prepare our story as one cohesive thing so that we're ready. But, much like a basketball player will stand in practice at the free throw line and do shot after shot after shot after shot, but they're not going to ever be able to do that in the game, right? Or they'll practice, do passing drills, or they'll do like a bunch of layups all in a row, right? Those are never situations they're going to be in a game where they can just do that unimpeded or with no exchange from another player. Same thing. We practice our story, so it's all in one cohesive, sort of paragraph or small set of paragraphs. But in reality, we're going to use having that in the back of our mind as just sort of our preparation for being able to be in a natural back and forth. So we might share after they ask, what do we think? And we give the little mini one sentence and then connect it to our why and into our story. It's really a story nugget. It's like a little piece, little breadcrumb. We're not giving them the whole meal. Think of it as maybe an amuse-bouche. So we're just going to give them that little bit and then use that to model what we expect and hope will be a response from them. And a lot of times people will share in response without even being prompted. It's like when you tell somebody, you're a concert that you went to, and they go, oh, well, that reminds me of the last time I was at such and such a venue, or, oh, my favorite band is X, right? Like that's how we talk in real life. Sometimes we ask a question of the other person, and sometimes we just have a little back and forth. Okay, and Susan says, what if someone says climate change is a fabrication of the liberal media? So what I hear in there, right, they're saying fabrication. So they're saying something is false and that's bothering them. So what I might say to them is, it sounds like you care a lot and maybe are a little bit frustrated by not feeling you care a lot about understanding facts of what's happening in the world around us. And maybe you're a little bit frustrated with the way our media landscape is, and that it can be hard to tell fact from fiction. And they might say, yes, I am. And they might say even more than that. And you might then ask them, can you tell me how excuse me, can you tell me how your concern for truth and facts first developed? Or do you remember a time when that first developed in you, or a moment that care and concern crystallized for you, right? So actually, let me stop there on that. And so what we're trying to do by asking those questions is to get them into talking about how their values have formed that are underlying their frustration, right? Like it's not going to be productive at that stage to litigate the truth or falsity of what they have termed the liberal media, but rather to understand what is the emotion, what is the value that's underlying that opinion, and have them unpack that a little bit so that you can then connect a little bit of your story, assuming that you share the same value, right? You may say, well, I also really care a lot about being able to get facts that we can rely upon. And this is how that developed in me. And then there's a back and forth around that. And then as you're building rapport and building trust, you can, in a non-confrontational way, build your way back up to a place where you agree. You might say, well, you know, it's been really hard actually for me to find facts that I felt like I could trust on climate change as well. And one source that I really trust that is neither the liberal or conservative media is X, Y, and Z. Would it be all right if I took you to a meeting of that group with me? Or would it be all right if I sent you a video explainer that they have or a link to their website, right? So again, you're moving away from the confrontational, the sort of media driven, partisan driven talking points, and you're getting into those shared values. And even if it's a baby step, what baby step can we work up to from there? Um, okay, is it best to start with an unknown person or a person you know? That just depends on you, meaning that for some of us, it's much easier to talk to strangers. For others of us, it's easier to talk to our friends and family. Um, for still others of us, it's six of one, half dozen of the other. So that is really totally up to you and your comfort. The quality of the conversation is going to be dependent really on your capacity that you will develop over time. It's like practicing an instrument or a sport or anything else where you develop over time, the ability to have rapport and connection with folks and to establish non-judgment and have the conversation with curiosity and then bring it back to an ask, right? And so the effectiveness of the conversation, whether it's a stranger or a person you know, can be equally as high. That said, we are doing a specific program here with CCL to get some of those people that are the people that we know that we might not be able to get if we were just doing a voter list. And you could think of that as concentric circles from your network, right? You have your close people where there's really a lot at stake in the conversation. Maybe your immediate nuclear family, your best friends, the coworker that you sit next to every day. And then you have that kind of next circle of people that are maybe a little bit farther away. And then there's the third but you see them frequently. Maybe it's your postman or the chiropractor. And then you have that third circle, which are people that you run into in the wild. Now, I think all three of those circles are great, and they're still helping us get to people that might not otherwise be gotten to through a targeted voter list, which is a separate program that CCL is running that you can also participate, which I'm sure Madeline would be delighted to engage you with. Okay, I'm going to roll through these two more, and then we're going to jump into the content, but hopefully this helps ground the content in some real life experiences. What if somebody doesn't think the primary matters? So this is a great one. And there are so many different permutations of this, right? That the primary doesn't matter, that their vote doesn't matter, that even if their vote does matter, that the system is so broken that it still doesn't matter who wins. So there are lots of different permutations. And again, here we want to get underneath what is the emotion or the value that is driving that concern or that frustration. And it's like a rational thing, right? Why would I spend my time on something that doesn't matter? And so I think the first thing there is to say something on the lines of, and again, this is just an example, but something on the lines of, well, it sounds like you choose how you use your time carefully, which totally makes sense. And you want to make sure you're involved in something that makes a difference. And then you can share something that's true for you. I participate in the primary because, right. So you don't need to have like a global conversation about why the primary matters or how the whole system is broken or not broken or whether individual votes matter. But like, why do you, as a rational person who, has a busy life and cares how you spend your time. Why are you taking time to do this? Why is it important to you? And the more personal that you can be about that, the better. Again, this is about getting underneath the emotions, not necessarily about, about litigating the usefulness or not usefulness in primaries. And, something that's true for me personally, Brandon, that may or may not be appropriate for you to say is that for me, I see my participation in the primary as my currency to make sure that my elected officials are actually working for me. Because they tend to work for who it is that votes and listen to who it is that votes. And so the less that we participate, the less that's true. And the great flip side of that coin is the more we participate, the more that's true. But that is personal for me, and whether that's appropriate in the CCL context or your personal context is up to you. It's just an example. All right, thanks for those great questions. I'm gonna share my screen back out, and we're gonna go ahead and roll through our, whoops, that's not what I intended to do, and roll through our review of Brave. Okay, so our first step in Brave is to breathe. So we talked about last time how our instinct is to jump in with all of our facts and saving the person from their incorrect point of view, or from not doing the behavior we want them to do or doing the behavior we don't want them to do, right? And so breathing is going to slow us down, and it's going to kind of force us to move out of flight, fright, fawn, or freeze and to listen. And the pro tip that I want to share to take this to the next level is one that we already previewed in going through those examples, which is to approach the conversation with curiosity. So in other words, yes, we all know that we are having these conversations in the hopes that we will bring additional climate voters into the polls this fall and even before that. However, if we're so intent upon convince, we might lose the opportunity to find some of those breadcrumbs that will help us tap into the shared values, share the appropriate story, and be able to get on out of the adversarial framework and into a framework where we can move towards a shared action step together. So if we put ourselves in a framework of curiosity, that helps us both establish non-judgment. So these two pieces are connected. Curiosity is a tool that helps us communicate non-judgment to the other person. And it's very, very rare that people are listened to and asked questions about their thoughts and feelings non-judgmentally. So that really helps establish the rapport. And the more we can remind ourselves to stay in that curious mindset, I have found the more successful the conversations are. And after we go through these pro tips, I am gonna pause and take questions before we go into the story deep dive. So if you have a question as I'm going through these, feel free to note it down, and we'll take a pause to go through those. Okay, so then our next step, after we've, rather than jumping in, listened, calm down our parasympathetic nervous system, is to repeat back something that they've shared with us and follow that with a question. So we have the example here on the slide of tell me more, which is magic. Again, people are never listened to non-judgmentally. And to bring it down into the real lived experience, how does that affect you and your family or loved ones? The pro tip here is to keep bringing it back to that real lived experience. So it may take multiple efforts at this, right? People have a lot of muscle memory around repeating talking points that they have heard in the media, in their social media echo chambers, in their friend group echo chambers, right? We're totally immersed in these conversations that happen almost unconsciously. So it may take a few tries to actually keep the person in real lived experience. That's totally okay. We just want to keep bringing it back. Oh, okay, how does that affect you and your family? Oh, I see. I understand. That must be very frustrating. Can you tell me more about, blah, blah, how that affects you? You can ask that over and over and keep bringing it back to them. And it turns out people actually love talking about themselves. So, um, it may take a few tries, but nobody's going to be mad at you for asking about them, right? That's showing interest and care and concern. Okay. And then acknowledging frustrations. So normally in these topics, frustration comes up, right? Like, in the example of the sort of liberal media talking point, there's a frustration that's underneath that. So you really want to be listening for the frustrations that are underneath what people are sharing with you. And that again is where you're going to be a little bit of an investigator, right? People aren't going to come out obviously and tell you all at once. Here's my real lived experience with emotional weight, and here's what my values are, and here's how I developed them. So we're going to go bit by bit and look for those breadcrumbs. One of the breadcrumbs is frustrations. Understanding people's frustrations and asking into them can often lead to understanding their values and story sharing. And the first thing to do is to just validate those frustrations. And the pro tip here is to really listen past the facts for the specific values and emotion that's inside the frustration. And also just reminding ourselves, people may be saying really extreme things that we very viscerally disagree with as they're expressing their frustrations. And so reminding ourselves that just because we're acknowledging that they are frustrated or that they have an emotion or a value does not mean that we're agreeing with the facts of what we're saying. We are just acknowledging that they are feeling frustration. And that helps us then bridge to a time that the underlying value crystallized for them, which bridges us into storytelling. So again, that is our bridge to connecting into values. And the pro tip here, we already talked about a little bit as we were going through some of the what ifs, which is to share stories as a back and forth, modeling step by step that it's okay to share at deeper and deeper levels. And you may hit a little bit of a plateau with people sometimes where you get caught at a certain level of depth, and that's totally okay. Sometimes a person needs a minute to process. Some of the things that can help to break through that plateau are actually sharing a little bit more vulnerably yourself, because when you are sharing vulnerably, it models for the other person that it's okay for them to do the same, that it's socially acceptable in this particular context. Another thing that can be helpful is just to use a bit of silence. We had that on a previous slide, but silence can be helpful anywhere in the conversation. You have a sort of a roadmap for the conversation, but this person did not know they were going to be talking about how their values formed and how that relates to you and to climate change and voting. So they might actually need a little bit more time to process, and people will actually fill the silence when you put a silence there. And then, of course, there's the magic, tell me more. And repeat backs are really helpful too, compared with the timing, with the tell me more, if you get to a plateau in the conversation. Or you can say, it sounds like X and such, tell me more. And generally people will continue on. And then the last step, of course, is engage. And so this again is where we're seeking a commitment to a next step. And the pro tip here is to really focus in on what were the points of connection. So in the imaginary example that I gave in response to the question, about, what if they say it's just the liberal media that's made up climate change? Like the immediate next step that was going to work in that conversation, right, is probably not going to be. So I'm voting as a climate voter. How about you? Why don't you do that too, right? That is not going to be a successful ask. However, by tapping in to their need and interest, their sort of unmet need to get information they feel like they can rely on, we can create a next step that's more realistic. And so really focusing in on what were the points of connection in the conversation? How can you creatively attach a next step to that? And even if it's a baby step, and at the same time as being willing to offer a baby step, also being bold to ask really directly and with enthusiasm. So sometimes we get a little bit concerned that people might not really want to do this and they might say no. So we ask in a way that really isn't engaging or appealing and doesn't give us room for a straight answer, like, well, you probably wouldn't, but would you maybe kind of want to go to this meeting with me next week? I know you might be busy. I know you have a lot going on, right? Where you're sort of diluting the ask. So rather than doing that, once you've picked the ask, once you've picked whether it's a baby, middle, or huge leap ask, going at it with gusto and not taking the option away to say yes for them, right? We want to let them decide and not take away that option because we're nervous. So being really enthusiastic and robust. I can't wait to go to this meeting on Thursday. The group that I'm going to be working with is going to share some of the latest facts, and it's like such a lovely group of people. I wonder if you might be interested in, actually, I just did that wrong. Edit. I wonder if you would be interested in coming with me. They have a meeting on Thursday or Saturday. Which one would be better for you, right? So you're limiting the possibility of the no. You're saying these are the 2 times that this is available. This is awesome. I love it. I think you're gonna love it. And giving them the option, not taking away that option from them. Okay. I'm going to pause there and see if we have questions about the 5 steps until we go, before we go into stories and a little bit of a deeper dive, and we're going to work on putting together our own stories. Any questions, reactions, things that were unclear, feedback? Feel free to raise a physical or an electronic hand. Okay.
I have a quick question. Somebody had asked, which you probably haven't seen it yet, but what if somebody early on says, I don't want to talk about it? Or I don't know, like really puts the brakes on early.
Yeah, I think it depends which one. And also there are lots of different ways into the conversation, right? But if they say, I don't know, you might share, well, there's a couple of different strategies and tactics you can use. One is if you ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, instead of asking them a yes or no. So if you were to ask them, and actually, where is Lynn? Lynn, how are you imagining starting off this conversation? Like, what would their I don't want to talk about it or I don't know response be in direct response to?
She's not with us now.
It looks like she just dropped off.
Okay, no worries. So let's imagine that you have asked them, do you think we could be doing more to address climate change? So imagine that you asked them that and they said, I don't want to talk about it, or I don't know. If they say, I don't know, you could ask them, like, well, what do you think on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is we need to take a much more aggressive approach, and 0 is we don't need to do anything at all. And, so say they were like kind of, I don't know about it. So maybe they say a 5, right? And then that gives you the opportunity to ask them what's on both sides of the issue for you. And maybe they'll say, I don't know enough, right? And that gives you an opportunity to say, I felt like that in the past as well. Oh, is that Lynn back? Lynn, I wanted to know so that I could answer this question with a great deal of specificity. Um, to your question about what if they say at an early point, I don't want to talk about it, or I don't know. I wanted to understand what you imagined in your head when you wrote that they were responding to. Like, what was your tee up for that response?
Um, basically what you just said, are you are you concerned about what we're hearing about the climate change? Just
Got it.
something like that.
Okay.
That
So
would, that might be like, I don't know, somebody might say, I don't know to that.
yeah. What was somebody else chiming in with something? Oh, go ahead, Madeline.
That was a different topic. So,
Okay. Um, So in response to that, you can use this scale of 1 to 10 and imagine that they say something in the middle. You can ask them what's on both sides of the issue for you. And that gets them talking a little bit more, right? So you can continue the conversation. It also allows you to establish non-judgment, right? Because you're not saying, oh, it should be more, it should be less. You're saying, oh, interesting, totally with curiosity. What's on both sides of that for you? And that can lead you right into the whole pathway of how does that affect you and your family. If they say, I don't want to talk about it, it really depends on the circumstance. But I would say, honestly, like 8 times out of 10 to honor that. But again, it depends on the circumstance. The circumstance in which you might ask a follow up is where you could say something like, oh, I know these issues can sometimes be difficult or frustrating to talk about. Like, is there a particular reason that that's, not a topic that you really want to delve into? And they might say, well, I don't feel like I know enough. They might say, I'm a hunter and I just get yelled at by X, Y, and Z, right? And that gives you something to continue the conversation in the manner that we described before. Now, if it's in a situation where like, maybe something's going on in their life, or maybe they have to do something that's an emergency, right? Just, let them go. But we can do those gentle follow-ups and try to take a different route to unearthing their values and then coming back to the conversation. Marilyn, before I move on to the story piece, or Madeline, excuse me, did you want to chime in with anything?
It's in the same ballpark, but it's like just being at the beginning, not having had these conversations, I find myself focused on how am I going to start them? And so, and I know I have like a specific goal in that I want to be talking around encouraging people to vote and to vote as an environmentally minded person. So I want to find, so it's like from the outset, in a sense, I want to find out where they are on voting and where they are on the environment both together, and do that not in an unnatural way. And it just sort of gets me a little anxious, so I need to breathe. But
Yeah.
so,
Great
so
question.
given all that, like just like what are the openers? And I have managed to fantasize starting a scale of 1 to 10 conversation, but just take an acquaintance, like with an acquaintance, how might you start these things so that you get,
Yeah.
like there's some people I don't want to spend my time on right now, like, maybe not the dismissive people. It's like, that's not who I want to talk to really right now in this vein.
Yeah, great question. So, if you don't already have a vision of how you want to tee up the conversation, here are some options. One is to start with saying, just sort of have you thought about whether you're voting or not on X and such a date? And whether you're focusing on the primary or the general, depending on the timing of this conversation. I know we're focused on some primary conversations here with a lot of folks in the room. So have you thought about voting on X and such a date? Some people may be like, voting what? I didn't even know an election was coming if it was a primary, or they may think it's November or whatever the case, right? And so that gives you an opportunity to validate, right? Oh, yeah, a lot of people actually aren't aware, or and then it gives you the opportunity to say, I'm voting because I really am concerned about climate change. What's your feeling about climate change? And there's where you can reference something specific that's local if you would like to, or you can keep it more broad and national. So you could reference something that's local at the community or at the city or town or county or state level. If there's something going on that you've been working on with CCL, you could reference, well, I've been working on this and it's made me really attuned to climate change. And, that's why I'm going to be voting, because I really want to make sure that my voice is heard on that issue. And then you can use that to kind of prompt a conversation with them about climate change, and they might, if you share some facts with you about about what you're working on, they might start to ask you about that, right? That might, sharing what you're up to might do your work for you in terms of asking a follow-up question. I always like to have the 1 to 10 in my back pocket. And this is just a personal preference, right? For some people, you can do that in a very conversational, natural way. For others, it feels awkward. And as you explore, you'll find what your little things are. Like I found that found for myself that one way that I like to start these conversations when it's people that I know is when they ask me how I'm doing. I just bring in whatever I'm working on, right? So I think I said this in the last session, but for people who are new, or just as a reminder, a great way to start the conversation is, not to try to proactively pick your moment, but wait for them to say, how are you doing? And, oh, I'm doing well. I'm gearing up for the election and such. I've been working on this and such and that with CCL, and, and actually be yourself in the conversation, right? That's the most powerful thing. And, oh, what do you think about that? Have you thought about climate change at all? Have you thought about the election? Do you know if you're going to be voting? And then as soon as they latch in, you can start listening for those breadcrumbs and asking those follow-up questions. And as you ask those follow-up questions, you can then pepper back in your tidbits of your story to keep it going. So opening number 1 is asking them if they're planning on voting with the election date. Opening number 2 is waiting for them to ask how you are, and then sharing what you're up to and asking it as a follow-up. Tool number 2, well, I'll just say tool number 1 that can be used in conjunction with either of those is the 1 through 10 scale, if you feel comfortable with it. And then you can also create permutations of your own that feel comfortable to you in your voice, but those are a couple to get it started. Awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share back out my screen, and we're going to jump into stories. Okay, so in order to figure out our sort of first back pocket stories, and I always think of stories, our own personal stories that we're going to share in the conversation, as something to have in our back pocket, and that as we get more used to and adept at having those conversations, we're actually going to have multiple stories that we use in different circumstances, because we are complicated people who have had rich and expansive lives. And that means that there are probably a lot of different things that go into why we care about climate change. There are probably a lot of different memories that we have that undergird and have created the values that drive us to care about climate change. So we're going to ask ourselves this question. Why do I actually care about climate change? And we're probably not going to get to the essence of our story the first time we ask ourselves this mentally. Some of us might, but for most of us, it might take quite a few follow-up questions. You know, we might think, oh my goodness, it's so obvious. Like, how could you not care about climate change? Could be our first reaction. And then about 800 to 1200 facts might come spilling into our minds, right? It might be, I want to leave a better world for my grandchildren. It might be, I was raised as an activist and I've been knocking doors and making phone calls since I was 12, and this is what I'm doing it on now, right? So those are like the more surface level answers. We want to get underneath those in order to identify for ourselves what actually has made us, what values have been formed in us, and how that have made us the type of person that cares about climate change and cares about climate change enough that on a Wednesday night, we are in a training learning how to have difficult conversations with people to make a difference on it, which hopefully will not be difficult. Ultimately, they will be super fun and rewarding. And that is my expectation. That is how I find them. But what can feel like overwhelming conversations, right? And so you want to keep asking yourself follow-up questions until you get to a foundational experience through continuing to ask yourself, why? You know, why am I the person who, when confronted with the facts about climate change, doesn't get overwhelmed or doesn't bury my head in the sand, but takes action? Why am I the person that, you know, their parents raised them to knock on doors and be civically engaged? Lots of people's parents have raised them that way and they go another direction. Why am I the person that went this direction? And what is really underneath it from a values standpoint? Is it that I care about safety and security for my loved ones? Is it that I care about equitable communities and I don't want disproportionate power that lies in polluters to harm the lives of people, right? What is it from a fundamental values standpoint that is causing me to care about climate change? And then for some people, the peeling of the onion with the whys is the most accessible for many people way to get down to the essence of your own values in a story that you could share with somebody else about how your values related to climate change developed. For other people, this challenge choice outcome framework is really useful. This is a common framework that's used in community organizing, originated by Marshall Gans. And this is basically a tool for thinking about how your values have developed. So a lot of times our values are exposed when we experience a challenge. Challenge it doesn't have to do with climate change necessarily. It could be any challenge that you've experienced in your life, but in how you responded to that challenge and the choice you made, your values are often exposed. And so thinking about what is a key choice that you have made in your life, what were the values that animated that choice, and what was the outcome is another way to framework a story if that is more accessible to you. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to go into breakouts and we're going to bullet out the basics of your story that you might share. And this is just like, this does not need to be perfect. Does not need to be what you necessarily even use. It's just to get the ball rolling. So we're going to take, actually, before we go into breakouts, we're going to take 3 minutes to just bullet out some immediate things that come to your mind in response to these questions. And I'll tell you when I'm starting my egg timer. But before I do that, I'm going to go into this number 3 a little bit. When we're story sharing with folks about how our values developed, it's really important to include the sights, sounds, smells to really paint a picture for folks. Bring what you're sharing with them to life. So maybe you have a memory that happened in your kitchen with your mom when dinner was cooking that was a moment where a value really crystallized for you. What were the smells in the kitchen? What did the linoleum and the wallpaper look like? What music was playing in the background? That will actually help, even though it seems like it might be superfluous, it will actually help keep people in the story. People learn better through stories than facts and figures. And if it's rich like that, it will help keep them in the story to be able to hear the rest of the pieces that you are trying to share. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes right now in order to bullet out your thoughts on why you care about climate change, what are the underlying values, and what was maybe a story of something that happened to you in your life, an instance where some of those values crystallized, or one of those values, excuse me. That story does not have to be directly about climate change. It could be about something different. It can be, but it could be about something different entirely. It's about how the value that makes you care about climate change developed. So I'm going to ask for any clarifying questions, and then I'm going to give you 3 minutes to write out those bullets, and then we're going to go into breakouts and share. Are
How
there
many
any?
people do you want per breakout, Brandon?
I would love to have 2 people per breakout, please. Randomly assigned, not including myself. Thank you so much. Are there any clarifying questions? Okay, great. So I'm going to put 3 minutes on my little, so before we go to breakouts, let's have y'all do these bullets. So I'm going to put 3 minutes on my little egg timer. And would love for you, whether it's on a piece of paper, your electronic device, just anywhere where it's handy for you to bullet out some quick first thought responses, and then we'll do the breakouts to share them a little bit.
May I ask a quick question about bullet number 2?
Absolutely.
I missed what kind of follow-up questions we should ask ourselves.
Oh, that's a great question. It's just continuing to ask why. So,
Okay.
for example, if your initial thought when the question, why do you care about climate change, came up was, well, I want there to be a healthy planet for my children and my children's children and for my peers, then you would ask yourself, well, why is that so important to me? Why is it that I'm here tonight, but all my peers aren't here as well? What makes me different, and what happened maybe in my life that helped me to hold the value that is driving me to be here? So those are the kinds of follow-up questions. And they're all different ways of asking yourself why with greater depth. So we're going to go into our breakouts now. And what we're going to do in this breakout is just share, to share your bullets that you wrote down. And also, if you got stuck somewhere in writing the bullets, to share where you got stuck. So we're going to break out in pairs of 2 and just, introduce yourself to your partner, of course, if you don't already know them. And then you'll each share one at a time the bullets that you came up with, and any places where you got stuck in coming up with those bullets. And so this breakout we'll do for 5 minutes, and Jay, I'm just going to stay in the main room where the breakout, while the breakout goes. All right, welcome back, everybody. So would love to hear from a few folks in the chat with a raised hand, electronic or physical. couple things. One, if you would like to share a little bit about your own bullets. Two, if there was something that your partner shared with you that particularly resonated or you found powerful or interesting or of note. This is like, you don't have to share all of these, just as many or as few responses that come up for you. So your own bullets, something that was of note from your partner, and anything about, if you got stuck somewhere or a question came up. So would love for folks to type in the chat, raise a physical hand, raise an electronic hand. While we're doing that, I'm going to just share a little bit about debriefing stories. So it's great to be able to practice and give each other feedback. And there are a few key questions that we want to kind of ask ourselves and each other when we're debriefing. So for the listeners, what values did you hear? Did the values come through in the story, and what were those values? What images did you see? And what motivates the person? So this is a great way that we can kind of coach each other. You can invite your friends and family to coach you if you have somebody at home that wants to help you practice. These are 3 questions that, without any background in this at all, a person can answer, right? They can tell you if they heard these things, and that can be a pointer for what is working great and what you might work on in the future. So with that being said, anybody who would like to share about their experience in the room, their bullets, what they heard, something somewhere they got stuck?
Well, quickly for me, as a student, I felt powerless, because I didn't feel like I had enough knowledge or the tools to do anything, and I was very fearful throughout middle school and high school about the planet, and that's what helped me. But what was really interesting to me was what my partner in the breakout room shared. My partner was John Stolzenberg, but uh, he talked about Boy Scouts and how that uh, helped start for him an appreciation for nature. And but Boy Scouts, there's also other values attached to Boy Scouts, like philanthropy, and also his faith. John's faith also helped to develop a value of like stewardship, and how and over time that kind of ballooned into wanting to act on the climate. And he mentioned that he studied chemical engineering but wanted to apply it to environmentally, and so that helped shaped what he studied in grad school. And that actually interested me a lot because I'm planning on studying chemical engineering and I want to apply it to environmental. So, John, I'd love to talk more about that if you have time in the future, but that really interested me.
Brilliant. So great. So first of all, I love that you talked about that feeling of powerless, Yoon. That is something that just like ripples throughout our world right now, and particularly with the relationship to climate change. So like naming that and then being able to relate with people around that and move to a next action together that is doable is a really beautiful pathway to go on. And it sort of validates for people that they don't need to be like expert or feel like they're in charge in order to make a difference. So absolutely love that. And from what you heard from, I'm sorry, your partner's name was Tom, did you say?
John.
Don. Oh, yeah. So from what you heard in that conversation, Boy Scouts, so great. And then spanning to the actual values, talking about the faith, really, really wonderful. And also a great illustration, just that last little bit you were sharing about having similar career goals. One of the great things about story sharing as part of these conversations is that they really connect us on people as people on things that we may have no idea that we would have connected on. And that's not just like fluff, it actually makes the rest of the conversation easier. Now, obviously, we don't want to get into like too much of chit chat because then we're off purpose. But one of the most effective deep canvas conversations I ever was a part of was with my colleague Lestian, who he was having the conversation at the door and I was training and accompanying him. And again, we're not doing deep canvas here, but some of the skills do translate over. That's why I'm referencing it. And what broke the ice of these two incredibly different people, racially, demographically, politically, different across every external metric that you could think of, was that in their growing up, it came out in Lestian's story that he was in Power Ranger PJs and like playing a certain video game when his mom was making him breakfast. And the person at the door had a similar experience, Celestian raised by a single mom, the person at the door by his grandfather. And it just broke open the whole conversation and the vulnerability. So I just say that to say, you never know what little detail is going to break the conversation open and what people are going to latch into. And so including those sort of details, while still keeping, you know, your story reasonably on topic is really helpful. Okay. I said who I was going to go to next, and then I immediately forgot. I think I said Holly. Who was the other person? Tom. All right, we're going to go Tom, Holly, and then Stefano, I see your hand. Go ahead, Tom.
I was paired with Phil Smith, and I started sharing by just saying that I was a young kid, maybe 5 or 6. I was imprinted with just being outdoors. I grew up in Janesville, but about a block and a half from our house was this wild woods. I don't know, maybe 40 acres of it or something. I don't know, bordered by the Rock River, and me and my friends would just go play there constantly. You know, not every day, but plus we'd be outside running around. You know, feral kids as they call them now. And so that just imprinted me with love of nature and all that. And you know, I got to go deeper because you know, clearly that translates to wanting to preserve all this and you know, keep our planet healthy and everything. But so I got to go deeper into that. But you know, it turns out Phil had a similar story. So.
Awesome. Yeah, and a lot of us have those experiences, right? And what we're going to find with our stories is that if our story is about something that like we experienced that's out there, something having to do with nature, for example, or having to do with climate impacts now, like I think it was, I'm so bad at remember Helen shared with us in the main room because her partner wasn't present, and Helen had a wonderful story that was about experiencing current climate impacts. And all of these are great, and you can go right out of the gate with those stories. Our stories are going to evolve over time. I had a same story for 3 years until I realized they were like 6 layers deeper, and then, you know, my story changed and evolved, and 20 plus years later it's still changing and evolving, right? So you're all ready to start, and I want to invite anybody who has a story about I experienced nature in X in such a way to ask yourself, why, what is it about me that that experience turned me into a climate activist? Meaning, what happened in my life that 100 different people could have seen that, but for me personally, and maybe 10 other people, but just focus on yourself personally. What happened in my life that made me the kind of person that reacted as a climate activist? And I'll give a quick little micro illustration of this, and then we'll move to the remaining 2 people. Once in a training was working with a gentleman who shared about having this experience going to see glaciers and melting of glaciers and how deeply that affected him when he was told what was, on track to happen to those glaciers moving forward with his daughter. And it was a textbook, beautiful story, linear, clear, used all the visuals. And I asked him the question that I just asked you all, invited you all to ask yourselves. And ultimately, what we got down to was it was an experience as a child playing with Tonka trucks, and what he learned about fairness in that Tonka truck experience that really was driving his care and concern for climate change. So, again, it's okay to start at the level where you are if you were at an outdoor experience, and I want to invite you to keep on digging. Holly, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yes, I was with Linda Racine, and she helped me understand that I think there is a value to what I was saying, that for me, I grew up in a small town that was a farm town, but I was a townie, and one of the guys I really liked from early on just always smelled like manure. And I was surprised to, I remember just going to school and realizing she has a hole in her sweater and just kind of deal with these people that weren't the same as me, but we're all in it together because it was a small town. And the same thing went with our church. I didn't necessarily like or agree with almost everyone in our church, but I was raised that we're stewards of whatever we have. And so I don't have all the each point, that brings it to home, but I think it kind of doesn't have to do with nature. It has to do with another part of me, which is how is this gonna go? There's a part of me that I remember since childhood. How is this gonna go? So between the combination of those, I just feel like we're all in it together, and if not me, who? But yeah. So
I love that. Brilliant. And the earnestness, and this is where whatever is authentic to any of you, like when it comes across, it doesn't have to be in any textbook way. The earnestness is really beautiful and will connect you. It's not just beautiful, it's effective. It will connect you to the other person, right? I could hear in there your care and concern for others. I could hear that you have, challenged yourself to think of, and that it's also just in you to think about what is the future going to be for me and these people who are around me, whether they're like me or not. And so your story is beautiful as it is, and perfect and effective. And again, we all can keep learning and growing. I am still learning and growing. So the nugget I would share with you and to others who might have a similar story is to ask yourself, how did you become that person that when you saw all those different people you thought were in this together? Is there something even deeper that happened in your life that caused you to have the we're in this together reaction, and how's it going to go for all of us? And there might be some additional fun things there. All right, Stefano, you're going to close out our shares super fast because I want to make sure everybody can get out on time, and I have a quick next steps thing. So a micro mini 1 minute if you can.
Yeah. First question, what if the story expresses values, but we forget the link to climate? I think we need both, right? We need to be personal, but we need to link to climate. So I just want to check with you about that.
Yes, that's exactly right. But you don't have to do it all in one step, right? Think about how you have a conversation with a person in normal life. So we can talk about our values together, and then we can transition to how our values, and in your case, how your values connect to climate change and how they animate your climate change activity. So it can just be a step by step, but ultimately we do want to get there and say, that's why I'm doing X and I want to invite you to do Y. But then you're going from a basis of a shared value instead of an opposition disagreement.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Next steps. I have two gifties for all of you that I think Madeline will probably send in the follow-up email. One is a little cheat sheet of Brave. So it's a little breakdown of the steps. And number two is going to be a worksheet for you to keep working on your stories. So I want to thank you all for your brilliant contributions, your time and attention. You are wonderful and you're already super adept storytellers, and I can't wait to hear how conversations go. And thank you to Madeline for inviting me and Jay for doing our tech. Madeline, back to you.
Okay, wow, I can tell this was a great session because I am sad it is ending right now, which makes me very happy that we have the next one all set for you, April 25th. Along with the 2 sheets that Brandon mentioned, you will get an email with the recording and the link to register. And we will keep finding ways to keep sharing because this is so valuable. I also want to thank Jay for tech and June and Jill for all the work that they did on getting people here and reminding people, and all of you for being here. And I look forward to more.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you, Madeline.